The question that we want to ask ourselves now is, how did progressivism play out specifically in politics and government? Now, we're going to look at the national level for two reasons. The state level it is just too varied. There are too many different manifestations, too many ways that each state played out progressive politics, and there are just flat too many states. The other reason to look at the national level is that many progressives and many business interests who may or may not have been progressive understood that the nation was developing a stronger focus than the states. Focus is not the right word. The nation as a state itself was developing more so and leaving the states behind. The nature of federalism in the U.S. was beginning to change. And this is a direct result of industrialization and of creating a national market and national infrastructure for transportation communication, as well as the reduction of sectionalism at the end of the 19th century, which seemed to be reasonably natural, an intellectual phenomenon. Okay, so the Republicans were in power beginning in 1896, and that's really kind of where progressivism begins. Now, McKinley as president was not particularly identified as a progressive, though the beginnings of the movement had occurred in the 1890s. It's not until we get to Theodore Roosevelt that we begin to see the development of progressivism as a political movement that becomes part of the lexicon of national politics during that day. And it's really because of Theodore Roosevelt, who you see being very vociferous here in this picture. Roosevelt came to progressivism slowly. One of the things he liked about progressivism was that it was vigorous. And as we know from Roosevelt, he was a vigorous president, a manly man. And you can put that in quotation marks, and I don't mean it sarcastically. As a child, Roosevelt had been sickly. He had suffered some great personal blows as a young man, that is an adult. For example, his wife and his mother died, I believe, on the same day, if not on the same day, then very close to each other. He suffered greatly because of that and decided to move out west. He had already, because he had been sickly, chosen to overcompensate. And so he had been a boxer in college and at Harvard. And then when he faced these personal difficulties, he went out west to try to overcome them. And he lived on the frontier for quite a while. Roosevelt's a particularly remarkable individual, and would have been a remarkable individual even if he, and come to the notice of historians, even if he had never been president. So he combined some personal traits, I guess, some characteristics for good or bad with his political philosophy, and it all blended together in what would become political progressivism. He again came to the concept slowly. We talked about some of the elements of progressivism. Let's look at how he manifested some of those right now. Beginning with the coal strike settlement in 1902, Roosevelt broke from his predecessors in not calling out the troops, though he threatened to call out the troops. But instead of calling out the troops against the workers, he threatened to call out the troops to nationalize the mines because the mine owners were being more intransigent than he thought they ought to be. He also, in settling the coal strike of 1902, introduced the concept of the public interest as a third player that had to be served and was the proper role of government. not to serve the interest of the workers or to serve the interest of the owners, but to serve the interest of this nebulous public that really was the consumers, and in this case, the consumers of coal. Roosevelt also became known as a trust buster, though interestingly enough, his successor, William Howard Taft, actually broke up more trusts than Roosevelt did. Nevertheless, Roosevelt has this reputation as being a trust buster. He began busting trusts by applying the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies and restraint of trade, exactly what the Sherman Antitrust Act was designed to do, though after an 1895 decision called the Knight case, then it became harder and harder to apply the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Roosevelt aimed first at the Northern Securities Company in 1902, which was a J.P. Morgan organization. Roosevelt began a federal court suit to break up Northern Securities, in which he was successful. He also brought suit in 1907, his Justice Department, to break up Standard Oil and American Tobacco, both of which were successful in 1911 after he was out of office. But what Roosevelt is most known for, and his longest legacy, is that he was a business regulator. He only thought about breaking up trusts when he considered them to be bad, but he did understand that there are many ways to peel this onion, but one of the ways to peel the onion that confronted him at the time about what to do about business and about giant corporations that seemed to be pretty rapacious, and many people just didn't like largeness anyway and feared corporate power. What do you do? Do you get rid of corporations? Do you attack them one at a time? If they're bad actors, how do you calm the public's fear of corporations running amok and being out of control? Well, Roosevelt's solution was business regulation, and this is a reasonably natural solution and organic to the period of time. There had already been a number of attempts in the late 1880s and early 1890s at even the federal level to regulate corporations. The Interstate Commerce Commission Act of 1888, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 were early attempts to regulate corporations and businesses in general. Roosevelt did a number of things and led Congress to do a number of things, three of which you see here that went a long way toward both regulating certain businesses and with promoting the concept of business regulation as a viable mechanism for enhancing the public good. One of these was the Hepburn Act of 1906 that allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to set railroad rates. Now, they had never had this, the Commerce Commission had never had this power before, though many political and legal theorists thought that it should have this power. And the Hepburn Act allowed the ICC to set railroad rates. Now, railroads all squalled about this, and many, after 1917, blamed the failure of the railroads to respond well to World War I, and they responded particularly poorly on the Hepburn Act, but that's just a smokescreen. Let's skip the second one for just a second. In 1906 as well, and we've already talked about the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, Roosevelt shepherded that through Congress, and that was helped along by the public response to Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. Both of these trends came together to push forward a Pure Food and Drug Act to stop, or at least to regulate the adulteration of food. The most important thing about the Pure Food and Drug Act is that it allowed for inspection of the manufacturing of drugs and food at the manufacturing site. didn't necessarily pay for anything, but it did allow inspectors to go into slaughterhouses and meat processing lockers and other places that manufactured food and keep an eye on things there to make sure nothing poisonous was going into the food. Now, this doesn't mean that food is completely sanitary, but it did cut back on a lot of extraordinarily bad practices that were going on and were well documented. Business regulation also had longer legs in that there had been a push toward regulating business or giving business and labor a seat at the cabinet table. And Roosevelt did this by creating the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1906. These would be split in 1913, just as the new president was, Woodrow Wilson was coming into office, into the Department of Commerce and the Department the Department of Labor. But it was Roosevelt that created the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1906, and that is part and parcel of business regulation. The government doesn't just shake its finger at business and labor. It invites them to become junior partners with it, for good or ill. Also, Roosevelt was able to avert a fiscal and economic depression in 1907 by borrowing enough gold from J.P. Morgan, who he had sued in 1902, demonstrating at least that these boys had to bury the hatchet and not in each other's back to make sure that the economy of the United States would continue on its upward trend. I just find it amusing that these guys had to cooperate with each other, and they hated each other. Another aspect of progressivism in American politics during the so-called progressive era is environmentalism or conservation of natural resources. Theodore Roosevelt was a great lover of nature, a great lover of the West, and he believed that the federal government, in the name of the public, again, that public interest thing, should maintain control over large parts of the public lands of the West in order to preserve them in perpetuity. Now, what conservationism was for Roosevelt and other progressives of his era meant wise management of the land, not necessarily just keeping all of that land in wilderness. Really what they were doing was responding to rapacious exploitation of land and corrupt land sales that denuded forests and ripped up open areas to make mines and simply just trashed public land for private profit. And their idea, the progressives' idea, was to manage this, not completely restrict it. This was planned use of the wilderness to prevent exploitation. Between 1901 and 1909, the Roosevelt administration created 5 national parks, 4 national monuments, 6 national cultural areas, and 12 nature reserves, or also known as natural areas. Mostly this occurred in the West, and it set a precedent for how the federal government would deal with public lands. Rather than selling them off, they would preserve these lands and manage them in the public interest. Under McKinley, the National Forest Service had been established, and under McKinley, the fellow you see here, Gifford Pinchot, became the chief of the National Forests, the head of the National Forest Service. He was also a great believer in management and tried to apply scientific managerial principles, at least the concept of making policy based on data, for national forests. He was also recognized as Roosevelt's man in the Department of Interior under the following administration, the Taft administration. Now, William Howard Taft served one term. He is the physically largest president that we've ever had, weighing over 300 pounds, standing over 6 feet tall, and that's just his mustache. He was Theodore Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. He had been the governor of Guam and the Philippines. He was not much of a politician. He really didn't like the politics of being a politician. He didn't ever really want to be president. What he wanted to be was a Supreme Court justice, and he got that wish a little bit later, being appointed by Woodrow Wilson to the Supreme Court bench, and is the only president to have served as a Supreme Court justice after being president. Unfortunately, Taft and TR split over two seminal issues. One was the so-called Ballinger-Pinchot affair of 1910. Taft had appointed Ballinger from Seattle to be the Secretary of Interior, which many progressives considered a blow to their conservationist stance. Ballinger had been involved with a land deal in Alaska in 1907 and had green-lighted a deal in 1907 when he had been in the Department of Interior, but not the Secretary, that was kind of shady. Then after he left, he became a lobbyist and an attorney for the same group that he had green-lighted these land sales for, which were only marginally legal to begin with. And then he came back in as Secretary of Interior. One of the Department of Interior and Forest Service people out on the West Coast accused Ballinger of endangering public lands, which was a particular crime. There was a law against specifically endangering public lands by allowing this secret deal to go through in Alaska back in 1907. This guy went to Pinchot and got him on board. Everybody started yelling at each other. Eventually, Collier's Magazine published an article bringing all this to the public attention. By that time, Taft had exonerated Ballinger of any wrongdoing. Later, a congressional committee that seemed to be stacked. The public thought that the committee was stacked in favor of Ballinger. Lo and behold, found in favor of Ballinger and said that he had done nothing wrong. Unfortunately, this turned public opinion against the Taft administration. And because Pinchot was fired by Taft, then that turned TR, who was in Africa at the time, against Taft as well, and led TR to decide to run in 1912 to regain the presidency. A little bit earlier, TR and Taft had split over the so-called Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909. Theodore Roosevelt, like many of the progressives, was a free trader and trader, not traitor, trader. And Taft, a member of the old guard of Republicans, was not. He believed in tariffs and protective tariffs. So the Payne-Aldrich Tariff reduced some tariff rates, but not very far, and angered the progressives in large part because it appeared at first that Taft was going to support a more free trade tariff system. Well, when he did not, then the Payne-Aldrich tariff pleased no one. It didn't please the protectionists because it altered the formula. It didn't please the free traders and the progressives because it didn't go far enough. By this time, by the end of the Ballinger-Pinchot affair and after the Payne-Aldrich tariff, then TR had completely split with the Taft administration, which would lead to the interesting phenomenon of the 1912 presidential election. And we'll take that up in another lecture. Thank you for your attention, as always.